This is why I keep trying to get Tony to have stuff ready on site. It does put a lot of extra pressure on.
It's all that's going to matter is getting all the hours on the wash plant as we possibly can to hit our target. Anything to keep that wash plant running full tilt.
History has been rewritten in the Klondike. Kevin Beets has just pulled off the impossible. $110 million in gold, hauled out in record time. Not Parker, not Tony. Kevin, the man once dismissed as the quiet son of a mining dynasty, just dropped the single biggest strike Dawson has ever seen. And the numbers are staggering. Entire sluices clogged with nuggets the size of fists. Cleanup tallies that read like Wall Street stock reports. Rivals crushed in silence as one man rewrote the future of the gold fields. This isn't just another season, it's a turning point in mining history. And if you want the full breakdown, the numbers, the machines, the fallout, stick with me right here. Make sure to hit like and subscribe because you're about to see how Kevin Beets went from underestimated to unstoppable. The Yukon roared with diesel and steel, every machine chewing at the earth as it had 1,000 times before. But then it happened. A silence so sharp, it cut through the valley. Kevin Beets's massive wash plant shuddered, groaned, and stopped cold. Engines died, voices froze, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. Workers glanced at one another, unsure if it was mechanical failure or something else. Kevin stepped down from his perch, his eyes narrowing on the cleanup tray before him. What he saw didn't look real. Gold, not dust, not flakes, not the scattered shimmer they had chased for decades, but a cascade so dense it looked like the river itself had turned molten. Shovels trembled in calloused hands. A miner tilted a pan toward the high noon sun, and golden fire spilled across the ground like a miracle out of legend. Cameras caught men whispering, their voices cracking, "This isn't possible." For a heartbeat, it felt as if the Klondike itself had stopped breathing. Kevin, usually stone-faced, whispered only 2 words that would echo across the camps. "It's real." News traveled fast, but nothing hit harder than the silence on Tony Beets' face as he watched the numbers tally. The man who had spent decades carving his empire out of frozen ground now stared at his own son, rewriting history before his eyes. The king of the Klondike, the unchallenged ruler of the North, looked dethroned without a word being spoken. Old footage rolled of Tony laughing, mocking Kevin's cautious style. But now those clips felt like relics, artifacts of a world that no longer existed. Mini Beets took calls from banks, investors, and foreign buyers desperate to get their hands on what Kevin had unearthed, while Monica and Mike stood in stunned silence at the pit's edge. The Beets family empire had always been Tony's iron grip, his fire, his legend. Now, it balanced on Kevin's shoulders. And Kevin wasn't just carrying it, he was reshaping it. One miner whispered later that the moment felt biblical, like a crown passed down not by choice, but by sheer, undeniable force of destiny. And then Kevin revealed the truth behind his impossible numbers. Hidden away from cameras and rivals, he had been building something no one believed could work. A fleet of machines born from obsession, hybrids of old-world Dutch dredge engineering, fused with modern wash plant technology, monsters of iron and ingenuity. Rivals laughed when they heard of his experiments. Too expensive, too complicated, bound to fail. But now, those machines roared like beasts from another century, their steel jaws ripping through pay dirt at twice the speed of Parker Schnabel's best setups. The recovery rates defied belief, 95% retention, gold flowing so pure and steady it looked less like mining and more like conjuring. Nuggets rolled down sluices like marbles, as if the earth had surrendered willingly. Even the geologists, hardened skeptics of gold fever dreams, shook their heads in disbelief. Tony muttered on camera, his voice breaking against the weight of the truth. He built the future of mining under my nose. But the machines weren't just tearing through ground. They were digging deeper than anyone had dared. Their relentless jaws reached layers untouched since the Ice Age, and that's when the Klondike yielded its greatest secret. Core samples pulled from the new depths glittered with ancient streaks, proof of a buried channel sealed in permafrost for 30,000 years. What Kevin had uncovered wasn't just pay dirt, it was the lost river of gold itself, a frozen vein now awakened by steel and obsession. Old Klondike journals had spoken of it like a ghost story, the vanishing river, a fabled pay streak that prospectors swore had been glimpsed in pans only to disappear underground, swallowed by shifting glaciers. For over a century, it was dismissed as folklore, another hallucination born from whiskey, frostbite, and gold fever. But Kevin had treated the whispers differently. He'd spent years scouring archives, matching torn parchment maps and faded prospector scrolls against modern satellite data. A digital cartographer's obsession. He had built an atlas of absence, piecing together gaps where the river should have flowed. What he uncovered was staggering. A vein that stretched for miles, deeper, denser, and richer than anything Parker Schnabel's high-banked cuts or Tony Beets' floating dredges had ever grazed. This wasn't a pay streak. It was the backbone of the Klondike itself, sealed away until the 21st century. To geologists, it was El Dorado resurrected. To the old-timers, it was vindication that the legends hadn't lied. But to Kevin Beets, it was something simpler, colder, proof that patience and precision could do what arrogance and bravado could not. For him, the earth wasn't conquered by brute force, but persuaded to whisper its truths to those willing to listen. And now, the whisper had become a roar. Rivals in ruin elsewhere, the strike detonated like a bomb. Parker Schnabel sat in his office, maps scattered across the desk, diesel-smudged fingers trembling as numbers refused to add up. His best season, $23 million, wasn't just eclipsed, it was obliterated, rendered microscopic against Kevin's $110 million revelation. On camera, Parker's usual cool swagger was gone, his voice breaking as he muttered, "How do you even fight numbers like that?" Rick Ness didn't bother to fight. His camp lay in silence, equipment idle, as he muttered into a bottle under the glare of a lonely floodlight. "Game's over," he whispered, his crew staring at the mud instead of the sluices. The gold had always been fuel for hope. Now, that fire had been smothered in one strike. And Tony Beets, the king himself, the man whose iron grip had ruled the Klondike for decades, stood in uncharacteristic silence. Cameras caught him staring across the cut, watching the machines his son had built outproduce everything he had ever commanded. "I taught him how to dig," Tony finally said, voice low, the bravado gone. "Didn't teach him to beat me." It was less an admission and more a surrender, the kind that only comes when a king realizes his crown has already slipped from his brow. The headlines spread like wildfire. The boy who broke the Klondike. Forums exploded, financial tickers rolled, even Wall Street analysts mentioned Kevin Beets by name. This wasn't gold mining anymore, it was empire building, the kind that toppled dynasties and redrew hierarchies overnight. The industry no longer measured itself against Parker Schnabel's records or Tony Beets' dredging empire. Kevin had become the new summit, a mountain others would now have to climb or perish trying, guarding a fortune. But fortune attracts predators, and $110 million in physical gold was no ordinary treasure. Each bar, smelted and stamped, carried not just weight, but risk. Vault trucks rolled daily under armed escort. Black SUVs in convoy, their wheels cutting deep tracks into the Yukon mud. Helicopters patrolled overhead, their rotors chopping the frozen air like blades. Insurance firms, unprepared for numbers of this magnitude, scrambled to write policies that required military-grade protection. Armed guards patrolled the Beets claim 24 hours a day. Rumors whispered through Dawson City taverns of organized crime syndicates making bids, offers at double market value if Kevin's gold could be diverted into shadow economies. Some said mercenaries had been spotted in Whitehorse. Others swore drones had been seen circling above Kevin's cut at midnight, silent eyes in the dark. Workers whispered of strangers at the tree line, faceless men watching, waiting. Even the Yukon RCMP admitted off-record that the Beets operation had become a geopolitical flashpoint disguised as a mine. It wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about control of wealth that could shake economies. Through it all, Kevin remained disarmingly calm. Cameras caught him shrugging when asked about the danger. "It's just metal," he said flatly, eyes fixed on the sluice boxes as they poured out another storm of nuggets. The real treasure's still in the ground. That indifference was what unnerved his rivals most, and what lit the fuse far beyond the Klondike. To the crews beside him, Kevin's vaults already brimmed with enough gold to buy networks of claims outright, yet he treated it as nothing more than a prelude. To the outside world, that kind of confidence was seismic. By the time word escaped Dawson, the Yukon sky glowed with more than midnight sun. It burned with headlines. From Toronto to Tokyo, screens screamed the same words. Kevin Beets strikes $110 million, fastest gold haul in history. Reporters and investors swarmed north in a tide that matched the rush of gold itself. Dawson City turned into a carnival overnight. Tourists flashing cash for replica nuggets, executives stepping off private jets, journalists camping at the gates of the Beets claim. And in the middle of it all stood the same figure the cameras had first captured. Calm, distant, already thinking about the treasure still buried beneath frozen silence. Financial networks broadcast debates live. Could Kevin's fortune destabilize global gold prices? Futures whipsawed violently, billions shifting in minutes as traders tried to make sense of a strike this vast. Some economists called it an economic asteroid impact, a single discovery capable of rattling banks on every continent. But in the Yukon, Kevin was unmoved. He avoided the cameras, ducked the microphones, and gave no press conferences. When cornered, his response was always the same. Watch the machines. That's all that matters. To the world, his silence made him larger than life. On talk shows, they named him the silent pharaoh of the Yukon, a man who barely spoke, but whose dredges roared louder than empires. Yet the frenzy awakened something older than markets. Indigenous elders in the region whispered that Kevin's discovery matched the oldest Yukon myths, tales of hidden rivers of gold, guarded by restless spirits beneath the permafrost. Around the Beets camp, strange things began to unsettle the workers. Men swore they heard the sound of rushing water at night, echoing beneath frozen ground where no rivers flowed. Shovels left in the dirt would vanish, only to reappear upright in the morning, as if placed by unseen hands. Community leaders gave warnings with quiet gravity. The earth does not give without taking. Their words echoed like prophecy over the diesel engines and floodlights. Some old-timers dug deeper into memory, recalling a superstition whispered since the 1890s, that fortunes this large always carried a price. A death in the family, a collapse, a fire. The Klondike, they said, demanded payment for its gifts. Around campfires, the tales grew bolder. Workers muttered that Kevin hadn't just unearthed a fortune, he had disturbed something meant to stay buried. They said he woke the veins of the land itself, and that the gold was cursed to bleed consequences. But Kevin kept digging, ignoring whispers of spirits and debts. For Parker Schnabel, though, those whispers weren't the enemy. Kevin was. Parker launched an all-out counter-offensive, doubling his fleets, running 24-hour shifts, tearing through fuel and cash with the desperation of a gambler chasing losses. His maps were redrawn daily, his voice hoarse from barking orders, as loaders and dozers churned through gravel like an army gone mad. Millions of dollars in diesel burned into the Yukon night, but the ground refused to give him a miracle. Investors circled Parker like vultures, demanding answers, demanding gold. Every cleanup was broadcast with nervous anticipation, but when the sluice gates dropped, the trays mocked him with their meager totals. Workers sagged under exhaustion, men falling asleep at control panels, mechanics cursing as machines broke faster than they could be fixed. In Kevin's camp, every cleanup seemed to glitter brighter. In Parker's, even the gold dust looked dull. Online, fans and forums turned cruel. Commenters asked the unthinkable, has Parker's reign already ended? His legacy, built on years of grit, sweat, and youthful fire, seemed to vanish in the shadow of Kevin's impossible numbers. One rival miner put it in blunt, merciless words. Kevin didn't just beat Parker, he erased him, and the proof of that erasure rolled in almost immediately. The roar of Kevin's dredges, once just noise to Parker's ears, became the weekly thunder of reports that shook the Klondike. First 10 million, then 15, then 20. His tallies rose like floodwater with no crest in sight, each figure hammering home the truth Parker had already felt in silence. It wasn't just numbers, it was history rewriting itself in real time. Cleanup trays overflowed until sluices jammed solid with nuggets the size of fists, clogging riffles and forcing crews to dig barehanded like prospectors of another century. Photographs leaked of miners knee-deep in concentrate, shoveling gold by the ton, their faces slack with disbelief, as if they had stumbled into a living El Dorado, while the old king of the Klondike watched from maps that no longer mattered. Banks in Dawson, unused to processing such torrents, froze transactions. Vaults swelled with bullion, their doors straining under the sudden weight. At one point, managers simply refused to accept any more, claiming insurance couldn't cover the risk. The gold market itself convulsed like a storm tide. Prices surged, crashed, and surged again, fortunes made and erased in a single afternoon as Kevin's strike sent ripples from Wall Street to Shanghai. Economists scrambled, journalists speculated, but nothing explained the impossible consistency of his haul. And by season's end, when the final count was tallied, the digits stunned even the most cynical onlookers. $110 million confirmed, the single largest recovery in gold rush history, a mountain of treasure that dwarfed decades of toil. But in the wake of fortune came the shadow that always followed. Environmental groups, already circling, moved in with lawsuits, citing rivers poisoned by runoff, salmon habitats erased by dredge plumes, and scars in the permafrost that no thaw could heal. Their injunctions, landed on Kevin's desk like volleys in a war he never wanted. Indigenous leaders, standing firm, warned that the line had been crossed, that land, sacred for centuries, had been torn open, that greed had spoken louder than respect. Their words carried weight heavier than lawsuits. They carried history, grief, and prophecy all at once. Investors, once euphoric, began to fracture. Some cashed out, terrified the government would shut Kevin down, stripping the gold from profit to liability. Others doubled down, gambling on the fire still burning in the ground, convinced that this was only the beginning of an empire. The financial split mirrored the chaos of the camp, but through it all, Kevin stood unchanged. When pressed for a response, when microphones chased his every step, he offered only one phrase. The Klondike was built on risk. "I'm just finishing the story." His words, calm and flat, carried the weight of inevitability, like an avalanche already set in motion. And then came the ending, or perhaps the coronation. At season's close, Dawson roared with celebration. Fireworks cracked above the river, music spilled into frozen air, and every saloon raised glasses to the Beets name. Inside a quiet tent, Tony Beets approached his son with something far heavier than gold, his battered, dented hard hat, worn through decades of battles with the ground. For once, Tony's gruffness softened. He said little, but the gesture spoke volumes, the passing of a crown, not through words, but through sweat, scars, and stubbornness. Kevin took it, not with triumph, but with resolve. "This isn't an ending," he said. "It's a beginning." The vaults held a fortune beyond comprehension, yet Kevin's eyes stayed fixed on the dirt, the maps, the rumble of dredges. Dawson might have declared him king, but he knew the throne of the Klondike was no chair. It was a weight, a curse, a demand to keep digging. Whispers curled through the streets that Kevin had only scratched the surface, that beneath the 110 million still lay veins older, deeper, and more dangerous. The land itself, they said, had more to give, or more to take. And so, for the first time in living memory, the world looked north and saw not Parker, not Tony, not the old guard of miners who bled for their ounces. They saw Kevin Beets, the silent pharaoh of the Yukon. Not loud, not brash, but precise, relentless, unstoppable. A new king of the Klondike had risen, crowned not by cheers, but by the roar of earth yielding to his machines, and by the knowledge that the story of gold in the Yukon was no longer measured in ounces, but in rivers,